Hello, this is the Bureau of Lost Culture. The Bureau is dedicated to collecting and recollecting lost, half-remembered or forgotten countercultural stories. We love to dig them up, unearth them, bring them back from the dead. You can find out more about what we do at bureauoflostculture.com. I am Stephen Coates and I'm here with my comrade, Paul Hartfield. For today's episode, Comrades, we're going to return to the Soviet Union. But this time, it's around about the time of perestroika, and we're going to hear in particular about one Soviet musician. I call him the Soviet Punk Frank Zappa, Sergey Kuryokhin, the captain as he was called, and his band Popular Mechanics. But the theme of the episode is Comrades, because in 1983 and 1984, two intrepid BBC reporters were sent to the Soviet Union to make a series of documentaries about life there. The final episode of Comrades was dedicated to Sergey Kuryokhin, but getting it made was a proper Cold War story in itself, involving secret filming, tapes smuggled out in diplomatic bags. So I'm very pleased that one of our guests today is one of those intrepid BBC reporter producers. She is a film director, a film producer, a storyteller, a writer, and many other things. Olivia Litchenstein. Hello, Olivia.
Hello, lovely to be here.
And we've got current producer and everything else, BBC arts correspondent for Russia, Alexander Khan.
Hello.
Now, Sergey Kuryokhin was a good friend of yours, Alex, right?
He was indeed.
Yeah, right.
We worked together a lot.
So
and I was very much actually involved in the making of that particular episode of Comrades.
Right. Olivia, I mean, you look like you're barely out your 30s. You must have been, 8 or 9 at the time?
You should see the picture in the attic.
Tell us how Comrades, this series, happened. How did it come about that you did this extraordinary thing?
Well, for me, it was a very lucky thing, actually, because I had read Russian at university, and I had spent a year as an undergraduate at Leningrad University. So, and that was from 1977 to 78, which was very much still Cold War time, and Brezhnev was still in power. And then, after that, I sort of finished my studies and then started to work in television. And one day I got a phone call from the BBC saying, "Oh, people have told us you speak Russian and we're wanting to do this big series. Would you be interested?" in coming to talk to us. And I almost sort of got up and ran straight over there because it was obviously my dream job, and met Richard Denton, who was going to be the series producer of this. And so I then started working at the BBC in July of 1983. And we were, our task was to make a 12-part series about the Soviet Union. And it was the first proper documentary series that had ever been made there. And we were doing it in conjunction with Gosteleradio, which was the state body who, oversaw television and radio. And so it was a question of navigating those relationships, and we were always pushing for more, and they were always trying to push us back. So it was an extraordinary time to be doing it.
And I mean, an incredible first commission for you, right? I mean, to go straight into that.
It was absolutely wonderful, actually, because up until then I'd been working in news and I'd been making sort of short items and reporting on camera and doing that sort of thing. And so here was an opportunity to actually make longer form, which is what I wanted to do. And Richard Denton, who remains a lifelong friend, was extremely sort of generous and, really gave me the opportunity to make films in the series as well as to work on, the other ones, because I was the Russian speaker. Right. So.
When you went out there, did you have any sense, any inkling that this was the twilight of the empire?
I don't think that we did, because in 83 it was still pretty much as it had been in 1977 to 78. And although there was, I think when we started, Andropov was in power. Alec, you probably remember better. And then Andropov died, and then Chernenko took over, and then Gorbachev came to power. Indeed. So I think with this, because Brezhnev had been in power for so long, and then with this sudden quick succession of leaders, you had this feeling that things were then beginning to shift. But certainly while we were making the series, we were still very much subject to the normal kind of Soviet controls.
So you were minders the whole time? Everything that you were recording or filming was being kind of like monitored? And then the agreement was that when it was all done, that the edit would be done in conjunction with your colleagues in Soviet Union?
Well, the agreement was this, that obviously we gave them the slip whenever we could. And because, I spoke Russian, and Alan, bookbinder, who also came to work on the series, also spoke Russian, we were able, and we were quite familiar with the system, as it were. And it was a system at the time, and Alec will know this much better than me, that you could always find your way around a bit. So we were minded, but we were always aware of, we weren't naive. We always were aware of what was really going on, and we were always pushing the boundaries. But then we hit this kind of block, because with the film about Sergey Kuryokhin, what had happened there was that I had met Leo Fagin, who was then broadcasting on the World Service to Russia, which was, they used to try and jam as well. It was kind of, you weren't meant to be listening to it. And I met Leo, and he told me about Sergey, and then Leo gave me Alec's phone number. And so I think that what then happened was that we were in Leningrad, and I contacted Alec. And maybe Leo somehow had even contacted you. Anyway, so I went to see Alec, and then, we met, and then he introduced us to Sergey.
Right, so just to sort of back up a little bit, so this is the final programme in the documentary series. It's shot in Leningrad, and we're going to come back to how you shot it, because it's all quite Cold War, isn't it? Alex, you could probably say a little bit about your history that gets you to Leningrad as well, but maybe you're the best person to introduce Kuryokhin.
Well, Sergey Kuryokhin by that time was a very well-known figure in the cultural underground in Leningrad. And to give you some context, indeed, as Olivia rightly says, on the one hand, things were very much like in the sort of stagnation, as we called it, period, very much like the very Soviet ways. But on the other hand, things were starting to move. Things were starting to change. What happened in 1981, that 3 independent artistic organizations were set up. They were set up with the government, or actually even with the KGB control, but they were, one was for writers, critics and poets, the other one was for visual artists, and the third one was for rock musicians, Leningrad Rock Club. So they didn't have any access to the media, they didn't have any access to print machines or recording equipment or labels or whatever. But nevertheless, they were allowed to exist somehow in this kind of makeshift DIY underground scene. And their popularity was growing. Sergey's record was released by Leo here in the UK. So the Western press, the Western media were coming over and kind of recording the phenomenon. And when Olivia and Richard came, that was part of this kind of growing interest that the West had in this new cultural phenomenon. And
but who were you? I mean, so like you were a friend of Sergey's, but what were you doing in Leningrad at that time?
Officially,
you've been involved in music, hadn't you?
Officially, I was teaching English at an art school, but at the same time, along with Sergey and another friend, back in 1978, it was 79, we started something called Contemporary Music Club, which was an organization for promoting avant-garde, non-conventional music. That was banned in 1982. But as I said, by that time, in 1981, those new organizations opened up. So I was very much involved into all this cultural underground as promoter, as a concert organizer, as the liaison between the local underground scene and West, because I spoke very good English, and all these Western media. So I was very much in the middle of these whole things. We were very close friends with Sergey, and I helped organize all these concerts with Sergey and all the other musicians. So I was very, very, very much, well, I could probably even say in the center of the whole movement.
So this is an important thing, because you've got this official culture, unofficial culture, the continual theme all the way through the 20th century, isn't it, in Soviet Union. And this is all unofficial culture. So Sergey, technically extraordinary, gifted, amazingly experimental, could not even be recognized in his own country, but had already released a record with Leo Fagin in the West. That was Ways of Freedom, right?
In the West.
In the West
but
only.
not in the Soviet Union.
Do you have a little bit of a listen to something from there? So that's from Ways of Freedom. I play that on purpose now because it's quite it's like a deceptive introduction to Kuryokhin, but it shows that he had his chops, didn't he, Olivia? I mean, he was a sort of super virtuoso piano player. He could do all that stuff. He went on, of course, to do a lot more, but he was that too, wasn't he?
Well, I think that's what was so extraordinary about him, and I always felt it was so important to find a way within the series to represent this unofficial Soviet life, because when you were there, that was the life you lived, you know, and you kind of gravitated towards the intelligentsia, and there were all of these fantastically creative writers, musicians, painters, poets. And, you know, what was extraordinary about Sergey was, well, with Alec having this job teaching English, but really having a whole other life. You know, Sergey, I think at that time was a pianist in a sports school or something. Yeah. So, you know, because you couldn't be unemployed, you had to have a job. So, and one of the favorite jobs for the intelligenti was actually to be something like a heating engineer, where you could...
night watchman.
Or night watchman, that's right.
There's even a song, a generation of night watchmen and street cleaners.
So basically, you've got your job, nominally, a job which requires absolutely nothing of you apart from the fact that you sort of turn up for a couple of hours a day and then you get on with your real life. And Paul, you were going to say?
Yeah, so that's right. And I remember somebody who I think was a heating engineer said, you know, you see, it's very good because you sit there, you've got your book, every now and again you have a look, you adjust the knob, and then you go back to your book. So this was the sort of duality of Soviet life, and it felt, you know, extremely important to represent it. And then, of course, when you heard what, you know, Sergey could do anything he wanted musically. And so when you heard him play the piano, you realized he had this classical training and that he could be in the conservatoire and he could have been playing the game and doing all that stuff. But that wasn't who he was. So that, you know, in order for him to be able to find expression for his talent, he had to do this ducking and diving and weaving and bobbing that everyone did who really wanted to be the artist that they wanted.
That really comes over in your film because there's a sort of community of Sergey and his friends, collaborators, artists, all sorts of people. And they seem to be gathering in these kind of semi-abandoned buildings, I guess on the outskirts of the city, making use of whatever they can, surviving. I think he says he's surviving on a sort of half the average minimum wage. They're all kind of just scraping by. Was that what it was like, Alex?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, but as Olivia rightly says, those jobs that could provide you with lots of time to do your own thing, and you not only read your book, but you could write, you could compose there in wherever you worked. But the rest of the time was, of course, going into creativity. And important thing about Sergey, yes, indeed, the piece that we've just heard is just pure piano playing, and it's very kind of smooth and even mellow at the time. But what is important about Sergey is that by that time he was probably thought of as a jazz pianist, free jazz pianist. But at the same time, his background, apart from his classical training, which, by the way, he never completed.
Well, he was kicked out of the conservatory.
He was kicked out of a number of music schools, which is a separate story. But so apart from his classical training, his background, of course, was in rock. The generation of the 1960s, people like myself and Boris Rebetchko, we were growing up in the 1960s. We were a rock generation. And jazz came only later. So Sergei, when rock had become really popular really important, culturally important in the Soviet Union in the very early 80s, Sergei became a hugely important link between the kind of free jazz, more cultural, kind of ambitious, highbrow, if you want, culture and rock, popular music of rock. So he was bringing this high cultural element into the rock music. He was bringing his virtuosity of a musician, and at the same time he was borrowing the energy, the thrust of rock music. So he was therefore very important, and his popular mechanics, something that we see in the film, was an amalgam, was a combination of those two.
And I mean, in fact, of course, he's rather withering about the sort of official Soviet rock scene in your film, isn't it? He sort of, I think he says something like he's embarrassed when he sees them. There's this funny moment when the Observer magazine have sent a journalist out to Soviet Union to cover the rock scene at that time, and they've written about this band called Doctor. And they're all sitting around saying, "We've never heard of them. I mean, like, did they even exist?" It was almost like they'd been made up by the establishment.
That's possible.
There was probably a virtually insurmountable barrier between the two cultures. Amongst ourselves, we had this contemptuous attitude towards everything official in rock, in jazz. And there was no way we could have accepted. We were thinking of them as something really not worth even of knowing. That's why we were oblivious of bands like Doctor or whatever. So we were existed in our own world, and our own world was quite content because we had our own clubs, we had our own venues, we had our own media in terms of in form of Samizdat magazines, we had our own festivals. So we had a culture which was completely independent of the officialdom.
So let's cut back to Olivia. You've been introduced via Leo Ferry to Alex. You call him up. You're in Leningrad. You're already in Leningrad at the time, or did you go back out there?
I think we were actually there. We were doing another film about a film director, Dinara Asanova, who managed. She was quite interesting, in fact, because she sort of managed to be official but still be pushing the boundaries.
Yes.
But yes, so I mean, so this was this whole culture that we felt was so important to represent in the series, so I met Alec, we met Sergey, we thought, wow, this is going to be fantastic, we want to make this film. We then had to say to the authorities, we would like to make a film about Sergey Kuryokhin, who's, an unofficial jazz musician living in Leningrad. And they came back and said, no, you can't. So obviously that didn't sit very well with us. So then what happened was that we thought, well, you know what, we're going to do it anyway. But let's do all the other filming first and get all of that out the way. And then what happened was that I went in as a tourist with my then boyfriend, and we took, this is 1984, 84 or 85 that we filmed it. I'm trying to remember. But we took, the technology back then was not nearly as advanced as it is today, so that the video camera that was available was one which took a full-size VHS cassette. It's quite kind of cumbersome. Anyway, so in we go with this and, meet up with Alec. And then we spent 2 weeks in Leningrad, all of us together, filming.
Right, so I think you'd said earlier as well that it wasn't just that had they said that you couldn't film Kuryokhin, or was that he didn't exist? Didn't they sort of deny that he existed as a musician or something, at least?
I think they sort of said, well, there's no such, musician, and I think they might have said that, actually, and of course we knew there was because we'd met him.
Because for them, officially,
he's here.
For them, officially, he did not exist.
He did not exist.
He did not exist officially.
That's right.
I love it. So was there an attempt to get you to film somebody who officially did exist instead? Was that?
I think that there may have been suggestions of people, but, the thing was, it was always this sort of, for the whole of the series, because, Richard and I had done this sort of spreadsheet of the parts of the country that we wanted to cover and the sorts of people that we wanted to be in the films to try and get a representative picture of the Soviet Union, which was no mean feat because it was a vast country. And so we had wanted, Moscow and Leningrad and then, Samarkand and Siberia and Baku and all of these places. And so we had found all of these places and we had selected people, and sometimes they'd sort of nudged us in the way of certain people. But even if they'd nudged us, we felt we could make that work because you're always going to find out something, And so with this one, we just sort of let it drift a bit. And then when it came to it, actually, and then we wrote to them and said, we have actually filmed this and it is now edited. So if you would like to see it, because it was out of courtesy, we had to let them see it, but we didn't really have to, we didn't change it. It was only factual inaccuracies. Anyway, and we got this this was in the day of telex, I think. We got this telex back which said, since you did not need the help of us uncultured Ruskies in making this film, we do not need to see it. And I think what worked in our favour was that by now, we're sort of 1985, things really are beginning to shift. And somehow we got away with it and sort of all remained friends.
So there wasn't any acknowledgement, okay, he does exist because you've actually filmed and recorded him. It was just, nope, we're not even going to look at that.
Yeah.
You've been rude.
You've been rude. Yeah. You've done this behind our backs. And, of course I had, and I
Well, let's talk about that, because not only had you done it behind their backs, Olivia, you'd sort of, it's a sort of almost like Cold War-esque story of tapes being smuggled out in your suitcase. Tell us about that. Well, actually, first of all, Alec has introduced you to Kuryokhin. What was your impression when you first met him?
I think it was, Sergey was just so charming and shy, really. He had this wonderful mixture of shyness, but also arrogance and total belief in his own.
Shine.
Yeah, total belief in his own abilities because he was so talented, and you could see he had this head that was just buzzing with music. He could never sit still. He was always tapping out a rhythm or, humming, or he was just very kind of active. And he was also staggeringly beautiful. And so, as a kind of subject for a film, he was just perfect. So, it was just really exciting, actually. And then we spent this couple of weeks sneaking around and filming everywhere. And he was very open, actually. And I think, for all his shyness, very comfortable on camera.
He seems so in your film. I mean, for anybody listening, we'll put a link on YouTube to the film so they can see how beautiful and talented he was. I mean, as you know, because we've been trying to get a film made about Kuryokhin's visit to the UK, and so I came up with this. It's a bit cheesy byline, but as a way of pitching it, which is that I describe him as the sort of punk Soviet Frank Zappa, by which you would think of a guy with long hair and a mustache. No, he looked like a sort of new romantic film star or something, didn't he? He was beautiful looking, but he did have some of Zappa's kind of gigantic sort of experimentation, technical virtuosity, quite straight-laced in some ways. I mean, I don't think he took drugs or anything, did he?
No,
he was like
But
Zappa. He was
wit and humour.
very funny, wasn't it? And a bit dadaist. So
Absolutely.
like Zappa in that way, and obviously,
Yeah,
but a
absolutely.
complete generation later because it's punk. It's infused by the spirit of new wave and punk as
But
well,
also,
isn't it?
also the enormous scope of musical erudition, which kind of links him with Zappa again. So then
Yeah.
through the entire spectrum,
Yes.
be it classical, blues, jazz, avant-garde, rock, pop, it was all there. It was all in his head, and he used it all as much as Zappa did.
Yeah.
Did he know Zappa?
They met.
Really?
They met in
Zappa?
1988. Yes,
Yeah,
they
there's
met
a
in
picture on the internet where
1988
they
in
didn't
October
they? Yeah.
1988 when during Sergey's first trip to the United States.
Oh, fantastic.
They met in Los Angeles. Nothing came out of the meeting, but he spent a day with Frank Zappa at his home in his studio in Los Angeles.
We've heard some of Sergey's piano music. It's beautiful and stuff. Let's hear something a bit more kind of chaotic. Olivia, you're bouncing away that, bringing back some memories, is it?
It really does, yeah. It really does. I mean, it was funny actually because I watched the film again, you know, after we'd started talking, and it's amazing how it's like opening a box in your attic in a way, you know, it just all came flooding back, and I just suddenly remembered the music so well, and then obviously all of the stuff around filming that film.
Yeah, I mean, and you know, watching the film now, it's an emotional film, isn't it? Particularly as we know that he died sort of tragically in his 40s, didn't he? But at that time, I mean, what's fascinating too is when you're filming like a kind of bunch of friends, but they're all possessed by this kind of quite manic energy in a way, aren't they? And I mean, I guess they're reflecting what was going on in their country, which was, you know, the great unwinding was about to happen, I suppose, wasn't it? And then living an underground life, and there's artists and performance artists and some famous people and not so famous people, all mixed up together, weren't they?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think also it was because here was an opportunity now to be able to really communicate with the outside world, you know, and that was a very long time coming. So that obviously, you know, Leo with his Leo Records, for him, his mission was very much also to educate not only the West about what was happening in the Soviet Union, but also to let people in the Soviet Union know what was happening in their country. Because it was, you know, if you weren't in Leningrad, it would be very difficult to know about that. So it was sort of connecting that network. And I think that, you know, with us doing this, it was finally this chance to get known. And I know very poignantly, I know there's a moment, I think, in the interview with Sergey where he says, I think it's very, you know, it's very unlikely I'll ever get the chance to go to the West. And of course, he did get the chance. And in fact, the film
Very soon.
And much sooner than he anticipated.
Well, we're going to come on to that because, of course, your film, I mean, he went to, as Alex said, to America and all sorts of places, but him coming to the UK in 1989, 30 years ago, was prompted by your film. I'm going to come back to that, actually. But, Alex, you know, that time, all those people together, Timur, the artist, and Africa, and they're all sort of at it together. You were there, and Kuryokhin was there, we noticed, the Beatles guy who we've interviewed, sadly deceased. It was a proper underground community, wasn't it? And we were fascinated to read, to see in the film that this underground rock world, they were becoming very well known in the Soviet Union entirely through the spread of reel-to-reel tapes,
Absolutely.
weren't they, in cassettes?
Absolutely.
It was like a kind of bootleg, not bootleg even, but a sort of pirate distribution service. Nobody got paid any royalties. They're all skint, very evident in the film. And yet they're being listened to by possibly hundreds of thousands of people, right?
Millions of people, yeah. There was a revolutionary role that Boris Grebenshikov, a friend of Sergei, played in this, because he came up with this idea of not only just recording the music, but putting them out as albums. So of course you didn't have any access to proper manufacturing, but you had a reel-to-reel tape, and the tape was of such a length that there would be, it looked like, it sounded as an album in a way that there was one side about 20 minutes and the other side about 20 minutes, like a proper LP. Then you had a box, and on that box they glued on photographs which were specifically made for this particular album. So it looked like a cover album. It opened up like a gatefold album, and it had the name of the album, the list of the tracks, and the personnel. So it looked exactly like the album. And of course, by making them, it was actually handmade. You could only make what? I don't know, maybe a dozen copies, 2,000 copies. But nevertheless, those 2,000 copies spread, and then they were multiplied and spread over the entire Soviet Union. So the music was known, the music was listened to. And these people, that they became like underground heroes. They became virtually very well known. And along with that, people like Leo, people like Olivia and Richard, and lots of other people, they were coming from the West, and the music was getting known in the West. So we felt, and the musicians felt, the artists felt, that we were on the brink of something major happening. That this cannot, even though Sergei said that, I don't know whether I'm going to make it ever to the West, but nevertheless, we felt that something was brewing up. So that there was all this pressure boiling and brewing, and it had to explode. It had to come up with something major.
I mean, actually, just one thing I just suddenly thought of, because actually I don't know if we ever discussed this afterwards, because of course it took a certain amount of bravery to agree to let us film them, because it's all very well for us. We would come back to our nice little safe country and show the film. But, they were now the subject of the film and known. And I think what we always were worried about was their sort of safety. And we felt that if the fact that they were now sort of in the public domain would give a kind of certain immunity. But I wonder, Alec, were there any repercussions after we made the film?
There weren't. And that is a very interesting point that you are raising here. By opening up to the Western media, to people like yourselves, we knew that we were getting a protection. That the more exposure we had in the West, the more difficult it is going to be for them to suppress us. Because once Sergei's record came out, and there was huge press in the West, once your film came out, as soon as the authorities decided to, in one way or another, to suppress, there would be a cry out in the West. So we knew that was our guarantee, that was our protection. And therefore, we pushed forward full speed, and we couldn't care less.
But I mean, it's
after all, I mean, we weren't doing anything. We weren't even political dissidents, Of course, in our minds we were, but we weren't doing political dissent.
Well, I mean,
all we did was culture.
Right, it's culture, isn't it? So, I mean, a bit like our X-ray audio project, the people who are making music on X-rays, they were not political dissidents. They were kind of cultural dissidents.
Absolutely. You just want to be able to express yourself.
Or listen to the music that you love, or perform the music that you love, or go and watch the music you love, right? And I mean, it wasn't, I don't know, because I don't speak Russian, but I get the impression that with this music, it wasn't particularly lyrically challenging to the state. It was, I mean, musically it was challenging because it was kind of pretty avant-garde, wasn't it? And that's what Kuryokhin's saying is that they wouldn't put us on an official concert because they just wouldn't understand it, actually. It was completely out of reach, wasn't it?
I think it was the anarchy of it, because there were these wonderful sort of Soviet propaganda slogans, which were things like, from the saxophone to the knife is just one step.
But that dated back to the 50s, early 50s.
Quite right too. I don't like saxophones either.
No one likes this.
But it was fortunate, of course, that your film did get out, Olivia, because you had to just tell us how you got it out. Because you've shot it, which is wonderful, on handheld and all that stuff. But how did you get it out?
So when we had to come out, so by now we have all of these VH cassettes that we've shot. Meanwhile, if ever we were out and about shooting and we felt that people were paying any attention to us, I would jump in front of the camera and pretend I was being a tourist. So we had a whole pile, of VHS cassettes, which are quite bulky. Plus, I had some reel-to-reel to bring back to Leo, I seem to remember, for him to release another record of Sergey's. And I think I had the reel-to-reel of the Comrades theme music, which we had asked Sergey to compose.
Which you started the programme with.
Which we start the programme with, indeed. And so in those days, when you were coming into or leaving the country, they x-rayed all of your baggage. And so I remember thinking, I look back at it now, it's wonderful, these things you do when you're young and you kind of have no thought of the repercussions really. But as we were coming back out, I thought, oh my God, they're going to x-ray this stuff. And I'm going to say, these are just tourist tapes, but then I've got all this reel-to-reel. And I could hear my heart pounding so loudly that I thought it was an external sound. And then it came and I could see the x-ray and all I could see were reel-to-reel tapes. And for some reason, whoever was x-raying it was a bit bored and wasn't really looking. And so off we went.
God, you must have had a drink when you got on the plane.
It was a certain amount of relief.
Well, thank heavens for that. Because we'll come back in a minute, actually, because one of the consequences, apart from what Alex was saying, was the events in Liverpool 30 years ago. But Alex, just to go back, because the other big thing about Kuryokhin and Popular Mechanics, so you can see it in the film, it was a performance thing, isn't it? The recordings, beautiful or strange or wacky as they may be, they don't really represent what they do, did they? Because their concerts were like something else. Maybe you could talk about that.
Oh wow, that was indeed something else, and that's a huge shame. That there are a few video recordings, but even those that are there, they do not give justice to what it was. Because I remember being at a number of Popular Mechanics concerts, and you had your hair up, it was absolutely incredible the way he structured them, the way there were scores and at later points even hundreds of performers with animals, with
beating the shit out of metal stuff, and
the entire gamut of music. Again, from folk music to choir music to symphony orchestras to jazz and rock and industrial section with sledgehammers and scrap metal and opera singers and dancers and circus performers and animals, everything. And it all was happening at the same time on a huge stage, and you didn't know where to look because it was all happening simultaneously. And Sergey was like a god, towering over this whole pandemonium and directing everybody.
Well, they called him the captain, yeah. That was his.
They called him the captain. Yes, that was
the captain of a kind of insane ship.
But you felt it was a bit like the inside of his head, in a way. That there was some sort of manifestation, outer manifestation of his internal world. But he always said, I need a symphony orchestra, I need a circus, I need a zoo.
And he told me that. I interviewed him. I remember in 1982. Long before Popular Mechanics even started, and I asked him, what would be your ideal kind of situation that you would have for the music? And he listed all of that, long before he could even dream of making it possible, but he had it all in his mind.
Were the shows tightly scripted, or were they, you could feel that it was pretty much free form?
It was scripted in a way. He had this kind of very rough scenario that I remember I was at a number of these rehearsals, and of course no music was written and scored properly, but he had these blocks, and he would tell them, okay, well, now that this block, you guys, you rock musicians, come over, then you klezmer guys, you come over, and then you industrial section with metal, and at the same time you circus performer, you come out with the snake. Then Africa, you take out the goat and take him out onto the stage, you know. And then a guitarist would be suspended from the ceiling and descended from above, and at the same time play. You know, all of these things, he was making them up, and he knew which what should follow what, and he would scream his commands like, "Rockers, you go out! You fucking rockers, you go out!" Why do you
It was a far cry from sort of Rachmaninoff, isn't it? I mean, let's have a listen to a bit more from Insect Culture, which kind of gets a bit of that inside of Sergey.
Поочередно. Поочередно. И раз, два, три, четыре. Раз, два, три, четыре. И раз, два, три, четыре. Раз, два, три, четыре. И раз, два, три, четыре. Раз, два, три, четыре.
It's not an easy listen, is it? It's I mean, it sounds like somebody doing their exercises.
It's exercises. But then if you carry on, it got superimposed with some choral music.
Some choral music, yeah. Alex, you know, so the concerts were crazy, okay,
Absolutely.
and of course, completely. I imagine for you know. Young people, super exciting. For older people, probably rather alarming, and obviously for the authorities, rather
all
alarming.
people wouldn't. I mean, people. These concerts were not officially advertised.
Sure.
I mean, until later. So those who came were already initiated.
Yeah.
They knew what to expect.
And by the way, it was packed.
I mean,
packed.
it was
Yeah,
always
it says
packed.
that, yeah.
Even though it was
Film.
word of mouth, you know.
So I was you know interested. I mean, in terms of what is going to happen next, you know, perestroika and glasnost. The other thing which the authorities fear, obviously, is people gathering in large numbers, unsupervised. You know, all governments are terrified of that, aren't they? In some small way, did what they were doing, and people like them, you know, did it kind of help bring about change? You know, is part of the story of perestroika and glasnost that this sort of, as you said, this bubble sort of blowing up from the underground? You know, do you think that helped to trigger what was going to happen?
Absolutely. As I said, there was. I mean, the change was brewing, and as Olivia rightly said, after Brezhnev's death and the succession of the deaths of his successors, Andropov and Chernenko, they died within a year of each other, and Gorbachev came to power in early 1985, and he immediately proclaimed that things were about to change. Nothing changed much, probably until 1986, but in 1986 already things were changing, and this pressure, this cultural pressure from the cultural underground was enormous, and different things like the Comrades film, or Diana Stingray, who released this Red Wave album in the United States with 4 underground bands from the USSR called Red Wave. That was a huge media splash in the US. It was all over the media, like on front pages of Newsweek and New York Times and whatever. And of course, the authorities, I mean, they realized that there was no way they were able to continue to suppress it the way
They couldn't put the lid back on the bottle, could they?
Absolutely not, yeah. So they were forced in a way. I mean, I'm not saying that the cultural underground, whatever it was, rock, jazz, or all this music that we are talking about, that it kind of made perestroika happen. No, there were certainly much more profound economical, political reasons behind that. Social and everything, and military for that matter. We shouldn't forget Ronald Reagan with Star Wars and all of those things, and the oil prices collapsing. So there were much more profound, fundamental, serious reasons for perestroika to happen. But in terms of glassness, in terms of cultural openness, yes, what we did, what Sergey did, what Boris Grebenshikov did, what Olivia did, what Leo Fagin did, what Joanna Stingray did, it was all hugely instrumental. And it all contributed to the overall movement, to
And
the
was
overall
also,
change.
and was also happening, in other areas of the arts as well,
Absolutely.
wasn't it? In painting and
Right.
literature and
Yeah.
theatre, and there was this. I think also it was becoming less easy to stay apart and uninformed about the rest of the world. There was this sort of increase in information.
Talk a little bit about, because you're saying in the other arts, so maybe talk a little bit about some of Sergei's friends and contemporaries artists who subsequently became very well known themselves, like people like Timur and stuff, didn't they?
Well, Boris Grebenshikov became very well known, didn't he? And sort of
course,
came
yeah.
and lived in the West. Does he still live here now?
He lives pretty much in Russia, but he technically lives in Russia, but he spends a lot of time here in London and elsewhere, and he records here in London a lot.
And Africa, who's in the film, is really kind of Sergei's best buddy. He was in the film Assa, so became a bit of a film star, didn't he, and an artist in his own right.
Yes. I think all of those people, and like Volodya, as you were saying, the chap who plays the violin in the film and sings in a falsetto, Alec was telling me now lives in Sweden. So,
Dmitry Prigov, who was a friend, he didn't collaborate with Sergei in those days, but a bit later he became a hugely well-known artist, poet, lots of other people, even Ellen Trio.
And also there was this good sort of, collaboration between people in all the different areas of the arts, because when they would put on these unofficial concerts, they would often use the opportunity to stage exhibitions of, artists' friends' works, because that was an opportunity for people to see that as well. So I think there was so much collaboration, wasn't there?
Yeah, and the same Liverpool Popular Mechanics concert.
Right, so we should talk about that.
There was an exhibition of new artists. Same thing happened in Stockholm, where the Popular Mechanics went first, even before Liverpool. They were bringing, dozens of canvases of artworks, and along with the concert, there would be an exhibition.
So one of the consequences of your film, Olivia, was that Colin Fallows, who's now a sort of venerable professor at John Moores University, but deeply involved in the counterculture himself, him and his friend, they saw your film. I think Colin told me that he was in a hotel room and it came on. I'm not even sure where he was, and he saw your film and both got completely obsessed with Sergey Kuryokhin and wanted to get them over to the UK. And that story, of course, that's 30 years ago. That took 3 years, actually, because they came up against the same stuff that you did. Kuryokhin doesn't exist. There's no such person. Blah, 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 blah. They kept pushing and pushing and pushing. They couldn't get it to happen. And then Alex mentioned Ronald Reagan earlier. It was because of Ronald Reagan that Sergey Kuryokhin came to Liverpool. Let's have a listen to this.
Nothing would please me more than to see the day that a concert promoter in, say, England, could call up a Soviet rock group without going through any government agency and have them playing in Liverpool the next night. Is this just a dream?
Now, as far as we know, this was sort of, he just plucked Liverpool out of the air. Absolutely. Because most Americans, when they think about music in the UK, they think about Liverpool, or the Beatles, okay? So, and he probably just said Leningrad, This sort of throwaway comment sort of gathered gravity as it sort of floated away and became this big sort of thing. And within a week, Colin Fallows and Pete Fuller were told that Sergey Kuryokhin did exist and they could bring him to Liverpool. So it's all thanks to Ronald Reagan.
It's amazing, isn't it? It's amazing. Yes, no, because I remember Colin getting in touch with me and discussing it and, talking and seeing whether it would be possible. And yes, as you say, I think it probably took about 3 years. And then suddenly here, Sergey was here.
And I think in terms of what we're just talking about now, so it wasn't just Sergey. So what happens is that Colin Fallows and Peter Fuller, they invite them to Liverpool, and they invite the kind of a whole gaggle of them. So Africa comes and Timor comes and various other people come, and they do this thing called the perestroika in the avant-garde in the Tate in Liverpool in various venues around, and they come for a week, which sounds like a very full-on intense week. Were you there, Alex?
No, I wasn't.
Yeah, Olivia, were you there?
I wasn't actually, no.
So what they did pretty much what
I think
you
I was back in Russia.
Right. So Colin says that, that he asked Sergey what he wanted, and he immediately said, well, I want an orange marching band on stage with some Catholic choir, obviously, which is in Liverpool, sort of asking for trouble. Plus, members of Echo and the Bunnymen and the Christians and various other people, and all mixed up together, and they did these events and this exhibition at the Tate. And I do believe that half of them went missing when they were here, and they bought some magic mushrooms and disappeared for about 3 days. And Colin had to definitely go and round them up and bring them back. And of course, that was 30 years ago this year, which, as you know, we've been trying to do something to mark that, when we can hope we can show Comrades and stuff. So after that. Partly because of the event, but mainly I think because of the film and what you guys were doing, then Sergey and Co start to travel a bit, don't they?
A lot.
And so did you see him again?
Yes, I did. I saw him. Actually, I saw him a few times here, and I saw he performed at the Royal Festival Hall.
Right.
And I remember that was just so brilliant, because it was so extraordinary that given how, we'd met and what we'd had to do, and suddenly here he is playing to a packed out auditorium at the Royal Festival Hall. Amazing.
How was it?
Fantastic. It was great, actually, but I seem to remember it being a slightly more formal concert, actually.
No goats?
No, I think it was more just him on the piano.
Right.
But there was always that side to him as well. So, when you hear him play the piano, it was fantastic. And it felt so extraordinary, because I think we'd always been very hard to envisage that a time would come when, we would be able to be in London together and show him London. And then suddenly here he was.
And it's interesting now you remember this concert at Royal Festival Hall, which I actually can't remember. I wasn't here yet, but shortly before his death, in 1996, when I was about to move to London, and neither of us knew that he was about to die in 3 or 4 months. But at the same time, there were talks going on for arranging a huge Popular Mechanics concert at Royal Festival Hall. And you're talking about the Christians and Echo and Bunnymen for the Liverpool concert. At that point, he was talking about Ringo Starr drumming for Popular Mechanics.
Always ambitious.
Yeah.
Probably would have got him as well.
So they started to travel, and what was that like? Because obviously in the film, he's rather poignant in saying, "I don't think I'm ever going to get out of here," and it's a sort of pipe dream. But what was it like when he actually did manage to do that?
I think he just sort of took everything in his stride, really. It was just, well, okay, so this is happening, and I think Sergey wasn't somebody to show astonishment, I think. Is that right, Alec? Do you know what I mean? I think he just thought, well, okay,
absolutely.
so this is happening now.
Yeah. And he was using the opportunity to extend that it was provided to him. Like, okay, if the organizers or the promoter of this or that festival could bring up, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 musicians, fine. He would bring the core of Popular Mechanics from Leningrad, and the rest he would have them hire on site, So he would say, okay, I'm bringing this core group, but I'm gonna need a string quartet or a chamber orchestra or a choir or a circus performers and this and that, and then from the local talent he would form his Popular Mechanics, or occasionally he could have I don't know, bring 20 people, so then he would bring the entire band from Leningrad. So whatever the chances he had, he would use them.
He was focused on the work. He was really focused on the work. And he was so extraordinary to watch as well when he was, conducting Popular Mechanics, because he did it in a extremely idiosyncratic way and used his whole body.
To put it mildly.
So, he would leap in the... He would leap in the air. He would, use his whole body. If he wanted people to be quieter, he would, sort of squeeze the air. And so that was
he would
as
lie on
much.
his back and conduct with his legs.
Yeah, that
I
was
mean,
as
he
much
was.
part
He
of the
was. I was
performance.
watching him do
Showman.
that in the film, and he's like a child in a way, isn't it? Like the way that an enthusiastic child will be. You know. Meanwhile, of course, back home, Glasnost's perestroika have happened, or sort of happened, the great unwinding of the Soviet Empire. And of course, he starts to become quite famous, doesn't he? And I wanted Alex to talk about a particular incident which made him very famous, which is the TV show where he sort of performs this kind of trick of saying that Lenin was a mushroom, which sounds ludicrous, but was seen to have been taken seriously by many, many people. So maybe Alex, just tell us what happened, because that catapulted him to infamy, didn't it?
Yeah, that catapulted him into sort of nationwide fame. And probably now, if you ask somebody, I mean, people in the street somewhere in Russia, who was Sergey Kuryokhin, probably the most immediate associations for most would be Lenin was a mushroom. That was indeed a huge, carefully planned and wonderfully executed television prank, which was going on for 2 hours in a studio in Leningrad TV, where his friend Sergei Sholokhov, who was a host of a regular TV show called The Fifth Wheel, and Sergey Kuryokhin had prepared lots of video material, like old footage with Lenin and pseudoscientists who were commenting on this or that aspect, and they were remembering how Lenin was fond of picking mushrooms and how he was collecting this or that, and like all these crazy ideas, and they were all brought together, and with full seriousness for 2 hours they were talking and proving that Lenin was indeed a mushroom, and they were going back to, I don't know, religious mythology and Mexican legends and everything, and political whatever theories and conspiracy theories. Sergei later said that the idea came to him because when with perestroika and with glasnost, all sorts of conspiracy theories were mushrooming in Russian media and on Russian television. And when he saw that on a program on television that the famous poet Sergei Yesenin was it was like common knowledge that Yesenin committed suicide, and there was this theory that Yesenin did not actually commit suicide, but he was assassinated. And Sergei was kind of, oh gosh, now you could prove anything. And so he came up with this absolutely crazy, wild idea to kind of play this prank on television.
Well, the astonishing thing, I think, from the outside, two astonishing things about it. First of all, is that because lots of people took it at face value.
Well, I don't know whether. Well, yeah, some people did take it at the face value.
And the second thing is that to say such a thing
Sacrilege.
would have been absolute heresy, punishable in earlier times by being shot, wouldn't it? I mean, to say something like that about Lenin 20 years before.
This was 1991. And by that time, we had glasnost like going in full swing since 1989. So there were lots and tons of material about Lenin, about communism, about Bolshevism, about Stalin, that from political point of view, it was not such a novelty to kind of dethrone Lenin. Lenin had pretty much already been dethroned. So the revolutionary...
He hadn't been turned into a fungus, though. I mean, that's the step beyond, isn't it?
Exactly. That's the step beyond.
Surely for older people in the Soviet Union, it's one thing with sort of youngsters, but I mean for older people, that must have really gone right to the root of it. Whether or not you believed it, the fact that somebody was on TV saying that for somebody who's in their 50s, 60s.
There was still inertia in terms of people still sort of brought up on decades of Soviet propaganda. People were believed what
Lenin was a
official...
god.
Not only that Lenin was a god, but they believed that what the official propaganda, what the official media were saying. And if this is said on television, that there should
be
be
true.
something to it.
To be fair, also, Russians do love mushrooms. And they love to gather them. And
true.
can be found, in Hyde Park
Yeah.
doing the same. So,
And there is a sort of dadaist streak that's
Yeah.
gone through
Surreal.
Russian culture, surrealist, isn't it? So it's in the context of that. Of course, we'll talk a little bit in a second about Sergey's tragic end, but I want to play a track which you suggested, Alex, from the children's album, which was released after he died, I think.
играть со мной. Он ведь ручной. Я хочу глаза твои губами целовать опять, но только губами. Винценос сидит, Златоглав летит. Он хотел бы стать сурком, мотыльком, сладким.
That's right up my street. It's quite cheesy in a way, and I don't know. Obviously, I don't understand the Russian.
That's the whole
quite
point.
That's the point, right? Did you understand that? Olivia?
Yeah, but it's sort of slightly sentimental and rather
Sentimental.
cute, and
Yeah.
you can hear that Sergei is taking the piss, really.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I don't care. 'Cause I'm
What was the theme of the lyrics on that? Was it,
Well, that was
it's
that
just
one
too
bathing in your
twee,
eyes
was it?
and-
Groundhog. It's called groundhog. Groundhog is the animal, right? The
an animal, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's called groundhog sing. I want to kiss you. I want to kiss you with my eyes, with my lips. It's very kitschy, very cheesy,
Kitsch,
yes.
yeah.
But at the same time, there's
Sweet.
enormous tongue in cheek in there.
Yeah, and funnily enough, actually, it reminds me a bit of Gainsbourg, another Russian, of course, living in France, and
Who?
there's Serge Gainsbourg.
Russian.
Called
Okay.
Gainsborough, as you say,
Yeah.
as he rebranded himself, a Russian Jew living in France, and because Gainsbourg too had this kind of incredible sweep, didn't he, of sort of technical virtuosity, a piss taker really as well. You know, the man who lit a 100-franc note and burnt it on French TV, you know, and all that stuff. He had something in common with that, I think. Let's move on to the sort of sad stuff, though, because tragically, in his early 40s, 42, Kuryokhin died of a very rare form of cancer, didn't he? Heart cancer, and out of the blue, right?
Pretty much.
Olivia, maybe when did you last see him?
I think I last saw him it was the early 90s when he was over here. And I remember him being at my house and having dinner. And I can't remember which trip that was, but I think it was maybe a couple of years after that he died. And it's one of those weird things, isn't it? Because I sort of remember being told on the phone, and I remember where I was in my house and feeling really utterly devastated.
I mean, it's sort of much overused phrase, isn't it? Sort of tragically early death. I mean, you know, all early deaths are tragic in a way, but of course, in his case, because he was sort of phenomenally talented, phenomenally charming, and also, you know, instrumental in bringing about that change. It was a tragedy, wasn't it, that he got? And
weirdly, as well, I had two other, Russian friends who had died at the age of 42. One was a Moscow actor, and the other was Dinara Asanova, who was the film director. And I just felt it was just, I don't know, it was like a curse somehow. But with Sergei, I think it was just so impossible to believe that he'd been extinguished, you know. I mean, far worse for you, Alec, of course. But.
Yes.
What was that like, Alex, then, when it happened?
Well, as I said, I saw him in March, right before I moved here, and a month has passed. I was just sort of trying to make a brought in my family, so new job, new country, everything, of course. And as I said, Sergei mentioned this Popular Mechanics concert, which I was just got in contact with the what was his name? I can't recall now. The guy who ran the program at the Royal Festival Hall. We were started talking, and then in early May, I'm getting a phone call from a friend who says that Sergey is in hospital. He has this terrible heart cancer, and he's got 2 months to live. And he never got out of the hospital. He got out for one night, I think, in late May. And at that point, I knew that he would be coming out. And his wife, Nastya, told me that on that particular night that he would be at home. So I called and we had a long conversation for about 40 minutes or so. And he wasn't told by his family or friends what was happening to him and how serious the disease was. And I was playing along, and I was telling him, well, look, I'm coming over in a month's time, in early June, and you sure would be better by then, and we'll be whatever, doing our regular things together. And of course, he died on the 9th of July, which was pretty much exactly 2 months after I heard the news on the 5th of May. And on the 9th of July, he was gone.
Did you go there for the funeral?
I didn't. I didn't go for the funeral. I went because I was supposed to come. I was still at work. It was my first year with the BBC. And I came like literally a couple of weeks later. And I went, of course, to the cemetery, and
Since then, you, and with Nastya, Sergey's wife, you have been instrumental in sort of keeping his legacy alive. In fact, it's not keeping it alive because it's grown, hasn't it? Actually, he's become recognised, and in St. Petersburg there is the Kuryokhin Festival, isn't there, in the centre, and so it's very much
the
kind of
Kuryokhin Award.
Kuryokhin Award, yeah. So he sort of lives on, doesn't he?
Yeah, it does. Very much so. Very much so.
So how will you remember him?
Well, I will remember him in many, many ways. I mean, as a friend, as probably one of the most interesting, creative, ambitious, talented artists that ever existed and that I ever knew, either personally or as someone who's been involved in arts for my entire life. So,
well, you can see what we've been talking about in Olivia's film. We'll post the link to that in the notes. And just to say, I mean, I went to see your latest film, the biopic of Teddy Pendergrass, the week before last. Olivia, amazing.
Thank you.
Knocked spots off the Freddie Mercury film, I thought.
Thank you. Again,
That's amazing.
fantastic talent and an extraordinary life story.
Yeah, absolutely so. And so thank you for all that. And thanks, Alex. We hope we'll be reunited at the end of the year in a sort of 30-year anniversary celebration of the Liverpool event. Yeah, sort of funding allowing. But that's it. We're going to play out with the closing music from the final film of Comrades, the film about Kuryokhin.
Called All That Jazz, by the way.
I'll call All That Jazz. And this is a recording that you made of Sergey at the piano at the end of the film. The final music of the final episode of the series Comrades, made by Olivia Litchenstein back in the 1980s, featuring Sergey Kuryokhin on the piano there. You've been listening to the Bureau of Lost Culture. You can check us out, bureauoflostculture.com. We'll be back next time with more lost, half forgotten, or barely remembered counter-cultural stories.